gentlemen, it's good to be back at a ULI meeting. Once, Lisette, we met in Hamburg, and now it's good to be back here in London. I've been here many times. You can imagine that. The relationship between Dutch prime ministers and London is an interesting one. I have seen some Dutch guys. You know, during the Second World War, for obvious reasons, our government was here in London. And we had a famous prime minister, Mr. Gerbrandy. He had huge capabilities, but he had one difficulty: his English was a bit poor. So when he had the first meeting with Mr. Churchill, the then Prime Minister, "Goodbye, Mr. Churchill," when he entered the room. And Churchill replied, "This was the shortest meeting I ever had." If you would ask me, what was your best moment geopolitically as Prime Minister in the international arena, I'm always referring to March 2009 in London, the G20 meeting. We were in deep trouble. But there was a kind of understanding of everyone that we need each other. We had to build up a new financial architecture. Some said we must finalize the WTO negotiations in 1 year, and we must make a success of the climate summit in Copenhagen. That was an excellent atmosphere. And compare that atmosphere with the current world. It's about America first, or China first, or protectionism, or trade wars. There are so many developments on the agenda. And then the question is, what about Europe? And I'm going to make some remarks about that. I have a disappointment for you. I don't have slides or PowerPoint. I hope you don't mind. That means I have to say something about the content of my speech and talk about the content. Many people will remember the famous British television series, Yes Minister, Yes Prime Minister. And once the Prime Minister received a draft text for his speech, he read the text and he reread the text, and then he said to his advisor, "But it has no content." And the advisor replied, "Thank you for the compliment, Prime Minister." So I have to say something about the content of my speech. One, why European integration? I will make some remarks about the two first waves of European integration. Second one, how could Europe and the European Union and the Eurozone survive after the crisis in 2008-2009? And then my third point, what about the future of Europe? In which situation are we now? Do you agree with these 3 points? Yep? Happy with it? Thank you very much. Let's do it. This was the moment of interaction in my speech. First, about the European integration. I think Europe is a great continent. We have beautiful pages in history and also dark pages. But we've achieved a lot. But the first half of the 20th century was terrible. The Great War, later we said the First World War. A huge financial crisis, and then the Second World War. And then people at the end of the 40s and the beginning of the 50s said, this should never happen again. And the components of a war economy, coal and steel, became the ingredients of European integration, the European community on coal and steel. We got the European Economic Community, Eurozone. And then people said, we must build up our economies. Try to have care, to take care for the economies and well-being of people. A common agriculture policy. And later on, there were other members who joined these European communities. There was a conviction, we need each other. And in fact, it was a success. And that was the first wave. And the second wave, that was in the 80s. Suddenly, people discovered, yes, we have a customs union. But do we really have a European market? And people discovered there are so many different standards and rules and regulations. There's a lot of protectionism. And then the goal was we should have the free flow of goods, capital, services. And that was the goal of Europe in 1992. At the same moment, you could see the end of communism. And that led to the extension of the EU. And then when you have one single market also, you must have one single currency. The combination of Europe 1992, extension of the EU, and the currency, the one currency, the euro, created an atmosphere of a kind of optimism. I remember so well in the 80s, in the beginning, it was a kind of Eurosclerosis. The splitting up of the European societies and so on. And then suddenly, when the perspective was there of Europe 1992, then people said, Europe is the place to be, the biggest consumer market, you have to be there. All this functioned. In the year 2000, heads of government said, it was the Lisbon strategy. Within 10 years, Europe must be the most dynamic economy in the world. Well, nice wording. But in any case, the atmosphere was there. Everything continued, and then it was 2008. I remember it so well. And time when I was Prime Minister. Something happened in the United States. The first question is, there is a financial crisis. Will the financial crisis fly over to the real economy? And the second question was, will the American crisis fly over to Europe? That was the question in the second half of 2008. And 1 year later, it was not any longer about the US, it was about Greece and Ireland and Portugal and Spain and other countries. And suddenly, Europe was in a bad shape. And that brings me to my second point. How could we survive? Let me go back to the year 2011. I attended a conference in Singapore, organized by Temasek, as you know, a big investing company. And there was a panel about global developments. And there was criticism on Europe from everywhere. From Asia, from America, from the UK. And people said, in fact, it's over. Europe is a kind of museum. That was the atmosphere in 2011. 1 year later, I went to Washington. I spoke with Bob Zoellick, the president of the World Bank, and Olivier Blanchard, the chief economist of IMF. And both said, the question is not whether Greece will leave the Eurozone. The only question is when. That was the atmosphere in those days. And what happened then? Then the heads of government, they started to realize we should learn lessons from what happened. We spoke about the competences of Eurostat, more transparency in financial policies. Sanctions could be delivered by the European Commission, so things were a bit changing. And suddenly you could see there was an increase of foreign direct investments. So first it was down, and then it was up, and then we had the promise of David Cameron to organize a referendum about Europe if he would be re-elected. He had a clear victory. He did not need Lib Dems any longer. But 1 year later, I thought, my God, I had an experience in my country. 2005, about the European Constitution. The government was against it, but there was a majority in Parliament said we should organize a referendum on the European Constitution. And we had a strange situation in my country that 120 members of Parliament, out of 150, were in favor of the European Constitution. Churches, social parents, everyone. But after the referendum in France, there was a very negative sentiment. Why a European constitution? We have our own constitution. Why should we have a superstate? That was the type of wording we had. Indeed, it led to a referendum with more than 60% saying no to the constitution. Referenda are risky affairs. And that is what happened here. And I must say, it's a risky affair when you have a referendum. And I'm very unhappy, as everyone is, I think. Mark, you were right when you say that. With what's happening now. I believe the UK is part of Europe because of the history and the culture, the economic significance. When we think about the Second World War, we owe so much to the British. It's all part of it. And now, speaking about what happened afterwards, it's also a matter of the balance within Europe. It's not only about Brussels or Paris or Berlin, it's also about London. I like that balance. And now that seems to be over. And I'm very unhappy with it. So, in any case, Europe survived. But, and that brings me to my third point, what is the current situation? What about what's happening now? I have 3 observations. I think there is a kind of gap. On the one hand, I think more and more people see we need each other in Europe. And we talk about the migration issue. We've seen developments coming from Syria or now from Africa. People do understand if you talk about migration, you need each other. If you talk about security issues, we also know the policy of President Trump. We have to work together. When we see the attempts of Russia to intervene, so for security reasons, we need each other. You referred, Lisette, to climate change. If you talk about climate change, environmental issues, we need each other. And if you talk about the global economic developments, and we talk about the attempts of America, China, and others to be the biggest or the strongest in the world, when we talk about Europe, we need each other. I think more and more people discover that we need each other. That's one side of the coin. But the other side has to do with the current political situation. What about Europe? You've been talking about Brexit. We have the weakening of the position of President Macron in France because, you know, the yellow vests, there are some difficulties. Chancellor Merkel in Germany. We have an interesting Italian government. Sometimes. You're very moderate, yeah. But with the remarkable policy steps, we have countries like Hungary and Poland, and they're not in line with the rule of law from Europe. So there is a gap between the intention and the necessity to work together on the one hand, and the political circumstances on the other hand. That brings me to my second observation. Which direction can we go? I think there are three options. The first option is, let's follow the UK. We have Brexit, we have Frexit, Nexit, Grexit, and so on. It's an option. In 2016, I attended in the week of the I attended Washington in the week of the presidential elections. I spoke with the Heritage Foundation, and that's a foundation that's supporting the Republicans and especially Mr. Trump. And their wording was, "We like sovereign democratic nation states." Sovereign. In fact, no respect at all for European integration. Sovereign democratic nation states. So that's the first option. Let's forget the European Union. Everyone will fight for himself. I think it is totally nonsense. That's not a serious option. The second option is, that is what happened during the last 10 years. The ups and downs, a kind of muddling through, crisis management. And I think Herman van Rompuy did a great job because we learned our lessons and we improved situation. It was not that everything broke down, but the last 10 years was a matter of a lot of incidents, making the best of it. I think this is also not a very good option because it will not lead to new dynamics. It's a risky affair. If you want to have a future-oriented approach, you must have long-term visions. I had a meeting with the ambassador of China in the Netherlands. I said, "Can you say something about the congress of your party in China?" He said, "Yes, that was about our future, in 2 steps. The first step was till 2035, and the second step till 2050. That's with their approach. And if you would, let's say, continue to go working as you've done during the last 10 years, it will not lead to a new dynamism, and I think that's necessary. And that leads to the third option, and that is think about and work on a more future-oriented approach for Europe. New dynamism, a new vision for Europe, and I'm in favor of that. And there are 4 components that are very relevant. Lisette, you referred to issues around social value, climate change. I think there is a great set of goals, internationally, globally, of the United Nations, the Sustainable Development Goals. We talk about climate change. You all are aware of the necessity to work on a circular economy. We talk about the new economy, robotics, Internet of Things, and so on, combined with social innovation, the sharing economy, and so on. And I think that it's about how to implement that vision in relationship to the role of Europe. I think we can take up our responsibility, so you can have a situation in which you can say, let's take up that type of goals. That's one. The second one, Europe of the results. Herman van Rompuy, the former president of the European Council, he always underlined the fact, show results to the people. It's not a vague and abstract entity in Europe, but also make clear that it is necessary to act. Show results for the people. The third one is you have to realize reforms. Sometimes decision-making takes too long. The institutions traveling from Brussels to Salzburg, sometimes you have to say to countries, you're not in line with our goals, you should stop it, and you must have sanctions. That has to have reforms. And the fourth element is also about European values. Europe is a continent of human rights, of democracy, of solidarity, of subsidiarity. And I think these values are very relevant to think about. So the combination of the global agenda, reforms, values, and showing results. I think these things are really key. That brings me to a fascinating book with the title, Why Nations Fail. May I ask you, who of you has read that book? Well, there's some room for improvement. It's a great book, and I think there's a big market for it. Once I gave a presentation, I received that book to thank me, and it's a book of 2 professors, one from Harvard, one from MIT, Acemoglu and Robinson. And it's the result of a 15-year study project, 3,000-year world history on one question. Under which conditions can countries be successful or not? And the answer is very clear. 1, If you want to be successful, you always must be innovative. If there's no innovation, you can forget it, and sometimes you have to stop with activities, creative destruction. Second one, there must be the rule of law. If there's corruption, if you don't have a good legal system, you get difficulties. And the third one is, you must have inclusive institutions, meaning that people must be able to share in the revenues of economic well-being. And if the revenues are disappearing in the pockets of elites, communist or capitalist elites, then you get difficulties. Christine Lagarde, the managing director of IMF, she had a column in The Economist, The World in 2019, and the title was Towards a Legacy of Inclusion, and it was about inequality, income inequality and gender inequality. In the same magazine, I read a column of Yuval Noah Harari, a well-known writer, and that was about beyond nationalism. He said, if we talk about today's world, and you talk about nuclear threats, and you talk about climate change, and you talk about disruptive technologies, you cannot solve these issues on a national scale. That's the reason he speaks in terms of beyond nationalism. And he said, if there are elections, ask always a politician, what are your actions regarding climate change or disruptive technologies? And also ask the politician, what's your view on 2040? What's your best case scenario and what's your worst case scenario? And if the politician doesn't have the right answers, you can't forget it. Why nations fail, it's good to underline what can change. And I think Europe has really a story to tell. And I think we can act. Last remark, and I see the moderator already coming. Jean Tirole, he's a French Nobel Prize winner in economics. He's written a book with the title, Economics for the Common Good. And one chapter is about Europe. And then he writes, among many things, we once again need a long-term vision. And he writes, we must rehabilitate the European ideal and remain united around it. I couldn't agree more. Thank you very much for your attention.
I usually act as a spectator, right? I'm an analyst. I look at how policies are made and their outcomes. And sometimes I see myself as a sort of market therapist. You know, I have clients coming to me, explaining to me that they're worried, they've lost money. And my usual answer is, it's not your fault, it's fine. It's because policymakers somewhere did not make the right decisions. But in the case of Europe, actually, I think we should meditate on this a little bit. What is actually amazing is that in spite of all the institutional shortcomings of what is a very cumbersome organization, actually the EU has managed to hold together during an extraordinarily difficult period of time, a massive recession, a double-dip recession actually in large parts of the continent, and it's thanks to people like Jan Peter that we avoided actually the worst, and that might be also a veiled message to the British government. So I'm coming here today with probably four main messages. First message, Europe is on the brink of recession. There's the B word we try to avoid, Brexit, but there's also the R word that we try to avoid, recession. I'm not, not going to be worried about it. It's actually a very real possibility that we'll end up with 2 quarters in a row of negative GDP growth in Europe. But my second message is that we are probably close to the trough. It's probably almost as bad as it's going to get because a number of those sources of uncertainty which are at the moment coalescing to generate this technical recession are likely to resolve in a way or another within the next, say, 3 to 4 months. So we have a lot of stress at the moment, but we'll probably have more clarity, let's say, by the spring. Third message, if I'm wrong, and if we stay stuck in this stagnation, near recession kind of cyclical position, there's not much we can do with the weapons we've been using so far, especially monetary policy. Yes, interest rates will probably stay where they are, and that's probably kind of good news for you in this sector. But my main message actually on policy is that because of the political fragmentation that we've seen, because of where public opinion is right now, the most likely scenario if growth doesn't recover, say, by the summer of this year, is that we'll see more fiscal drift everywhere. The answer from almost every government is going to be cutting taxes, increasing expenditure, responding to a lack of external traction by trying to reflate the economy domestically. Some countries probably should do it anyway, and that's probably a message to Germany, might be a message to the Netherlands as well. Some countries definitely shouldn't and do not have the space to generate this fiscal reflation, and that is likely to generate probably more disruptions on the bond market. So a general message of very low interest rates for core Europe, but with the possibility of actually massive movements on spreads, on sovereign spreads. So you know, you've seen those graphs everywhere. That's our real-time GDP tracker. So you read this in quarter-on-quarter growth. At the beginning of 2018, we were growing at 0.7, almost 0.8% on a quarterly basis. So we were way above potential. We had actually 2 quarters when we nearly overcame the US. Things were great. And look at where we are now. We are basically at 0, hence my message of we are in a state of stagnation or near recession. If you look at the soft data, the surveys, it's horrible. We are below long-term averages for the manufacturing and the services sector. There has been a temptation throughout last year to say, well, it's not really a downturn. It's not really a slowdown. A lot of it is due to idiosyncratic developments. And you have your pick, especially in Germany. It was the new engines for cars in Q3. It was the fact that the water level on the Rhine was too shallow in the 4th quarter so that Ludwigshafen could not operate normally, etc., etc., etc. I don't buy that. I think there's actually a very significant, a proper underlying explanation behind this. And the main explanation is what's going on in China. It's absolutely central. I think you cannot understand the current cycle in Europe if you don't look at China. That's a very, very simple calculation. That is the direct contribution of German exports to China to German GDP growth. At peak in 2017, remember those days when things were great. Exports to China alone explain 0.6% of GDP growth in Germany, which is a lot for a country where trend growth is about 1.2. And look at where we are now. We have lost basically half a point of GDP growth in Germany solely because of the slowdown in Chinese demand. And that doesn't take into account the second round effects coming from CapEx, for instance, the fact that in those circumstances, German companies are not going to invest very heavily. And you might ascribe this to my usual French schadenfreude when we talk about Germany, but there might be a message there for Germany. If you think that it's a country that has been doing very, very well, the same things for a long period of time. Big current account surplus, strong dependence on external market, and only actually a small subset of external markets, in particular EM, and dependence on a very small subset of products, cars and machine tools. So when you have, at some point in the system, a big chunk of those catching up emerging countries in a slowdown, well, a country like Germany gets hurt. And when Germany gets hurt, the rest of Europe gets hurt as well. And unfortunately, the situation in which we are right now, every month everyone is expecting those surveys to go up. Every month they actually fail to go up. And we start to realize that it's not just an idiosyncratic shock. And I saw this morning that even Deutsche Bank, which was my shop before I came back to Merrill Lynch, is now talking about a proper German recession. So the risk is actually real. Now, my main point, my second message is that it's probably not going to last for too long, because I think at the same time, while we need to recognize those risks, there are some mitigants. There are some reasons to be moderately optimistic about the next 6 to 9 months. First of all, because China has finally responded to the lack of demand there by a proper policy easing. It's a complete changeover in less than a year. I think the Chinese problem to some extent is that they got the timing wrong. They had a massive internal issue with over-leveraging. They tried to kill it, and they were right to try to kill it. But exactly at the time when they decided to kill it, the trade war noises came over. So they thought at the time that they could offset the drop in domestic demand that the deleveraging would trigger with a nice export boost. And this failed, obviously, because the US at the same time decided not to play ball. But there has been a complete reversal of the policy stance in China. You can see that in our indicator of financial conditions. It's going to take time before it percolates through the system. It's always hard to use monetary policy to restart an economy when you have financial stability issues. Odds are not a lot that the liquidity created is going to go to the real economy, but increasingly we're also seeing signs of fiscal easing. For instance, tax cuts, VAT, corporate tax for small companies. So as we progress into 2019, our baseline is that we'll start seeing some rebound in China. Also in the US, okay, I work for Bank of America, so we tend to spend a lot of time looking at the US, even if I'm a European specialist. I think everyone has turned far too pessimistic about the US. Yes, it's impossible to maintain the kind of growth rates that we had in 2018 because you cannot deliver a fiscal boost of 2 to 3% of GDP every year. No one can, not even the US. So it's only natural that we should see a slowdown. An economy that was growing at 3% plus is going to move towards 2% plus. Doesn't mean that a recession is in the cards. And just look at the state of the labor market. I know it's a lagged indicator, but still, a big issue in the US, and we've been agonizing about this for years, is that we had this drop in the employment ratio, the share of people in employment as a percentage of working age population. We had people who had left the labor market entirely, especially prime age people. There are lots of explanations. Maybe it's the opioid crisis, people staying home, playing video games in their parents' basement, and sort of things. Truth is, we don't know why those millions of people disappeared from the labor market stats. But they are coming back, which is a sign that you have a sort of endogenous strength in the system. And since I'm French, and as every French economist, I'm a Keynesian, so I believe in the Phillips curve. So I believe that at some point, if the employment rate falls, there's going to be an acceleration in wages, and this is what we're seeing. So the message is not horrible. Yes, we are living in very dangerous conditions right now, but we should see gradually some support from China, and we're not expecting a complete destruction of the US economy. Now, what if I'm wrong? What if it doesn't work? The institution which has, on top of the Eurogroup, which has really supported Europe and very consistently since 2012 is the ECB. The problem we have with the ECB right now is that it's out of capacity. Obviously, Draghi is going to say the opposite. He's going to say that anything can be reused. Truth is, we know it's politically and technically next to impossible. So we'll see sweeteners from the ECB. We'll see probably in March the announcement of another long-term injection in the banking sector, which is needed anyway, because otherwise we're going to get into deep trouble. Is it really going to move the dial? Is it really going to restart the economy in the Eurozone? Probably not, because I think this is really small beer compared with the stuff they used to do, in particular QE. Hence my point on fiscal policy. By chance, we have, in a number of countries, some fiscal support. Germany. No. And again, it's my French schadenfreude about, everyone in France has been calling on Germany to be a little bit more spendthrift for years, and it's finally happening. The structural balance of the German public finances is going to ease by roughly 1% of GDP in 2019. It's going to help a little bit. France has been forced into fiscal easing of roughly 0.5% of GDP. So we're going to see the beginning of this. The risk is that if the real economy, if the world economy doesn't start in a more decisive manner by the second half of the year, we'll see more and more of this. And there were lots of questions about populism, and I'm going to give you just a few thoughts about this. One, populisms tend to offset each other and create a sort of generic paralysis in Europe, and that is very true for monetary policy. One of the issues we're facing right now in Europe is that a number of countries are behaving like caricatures of themselves. And they are actually making the response from European economic policy harder. Take Italy. You go to Milan or to Rome right now, what you hear all the time is the ECB is wrong to stop QE, they should help us more. But they're actually making it more complicated because the sort of policies that we are seeing in Rome right now are exactly the kind of policies which antagonize the north of Europe. They are behaving like a caricature themselves. So the more they're going to ask for ECB support, the less they're going to get it because the more allergic to monetary easing the northern countries are going to be. And on the other side of the equation, you've got populists from the north which hate the ECB for exactly opposite reasons. AfD in Germany, for instance. So these two brands of populisms, if you want, I won't say right-wing and left-wing populisms because I don't think it really applies. But populism from the south and populism from the north are in a way conspiring to make us even less able to respond to a downturn. And if we are becoming caricatures of ourselves, if in Germany, increasingly even members of mainstream parties are very worried about, for instance, allowing some compromise with France and coming to some sort of fiscal integration in Europe, which would create a coordinated firepower. But they can't actually accept this because they know that they're going to lose votes to AfD. Also, on the fiscal side, we're stuck. We're paralyzed on the monetary policy side. We're increasingly paralyzed on the coordinated European side. That leaves what? That leaves national fiscal policies. And you're going to see lots of that. You'll see fiscal drifts everywhere because public opinion is so angry at the moment. And again, for very different reasons, that I think a lot of governments will be forced to cave in. Take Italy, it's a really interesting case. When Italy decided to get into a fiscal easing, it was in the summer of last year, it made no sense from a cyclical point of view. Why would Italy actually get into a fiscal easing when the economy was actually doing okay at the time? But now Italy is in a recession. So actually they can make a macro case for a fiscal easing. This is completely paradoxical. We've spent 6 months arguing with Rome against an ill-timed fiscal easing, which is, quite interestingly, becoming quite timely at the moment. So, final point. How do we find a sort of middle way there? You won't be surprised, coming from a Frenchman, to tell you that the solution may come from Paris. There is no problem in Europe that cannot be solved by appointing a Frenchman to the institution. If you look at the fiscal easing, which is currently being rolled out in France by Macron since December, again, in response to the protests. Yes, it's 10 billion euros. Yes, it's 0.5% of GDP. Yes, probably France should not do it because the deficit for 1 year is going to shoot up again above 3% of GDP. But at least the content of the measure is fine. At least it is not in contradiction with the structural reforms which have been implemented since May 2017. Most of the money is going to go to people who work. It's going to incentivize people to work longer. It's going to incentivize people to move away from welfare and back into workfare. So at least you can say there is no contradiction. It's a fiscal easing, yes, but it's a fiscal easing which is, at worst, not going to deteriorate potential growth in France and could even maybe participate to lifting potential growth. And I would compare this with stuff that we've seen in other countries. And again, I will take the Italian example. What I think problematic in Italy right now is not so much that the country is choosing fiscal easing. I think what is problematic is the kind of measures which are being chosen. Making it easier to retire earlier in a country where a working age population is already falling is not a great idea in terms of potential growth. making it easier not to go back to the labor market by creating minimum income is not a great idea in a country where the employment ratio is one of the lowest in Europe. So again, I think that the way out, if again I'm wrong and we need to get into more support in the second half of the year, is more to focus on the quality of the measures, because honestly I think that there is no way we're going to be able to avoid a generic drift in deficits, but at least let's make the measures consistent with potential growth. One very last comment on Brexit, because I was intrigued by this notion of mean reversion. And I agree we've seen mean reversion very often in the UK and glorious mean reversions. I would simply say one thing. What is the mean? What has been the mean in the UK since 1945 in terms of potential growth, in terms of productivity? And you can make the actually opposite case and say that the UK has had 20 fairly glorious years between the mid-1980s and the mid-noughties, but maybe it's more the exception than the rule. And what makes me nervous about Brexit is not necessarily the next few weeks, what kind of deal we'll have or we won't have. It's the sort of growth model which the UK wants to build for the next 10 to 20 years. We're so obsessed with getting a deal, any kind of deal, that we've stopped looking into the nitty-gritty. The deal which is currently discussed is a deal which covers the manufacturing sector, 15% of British output, which doesn't say anything about the services sector. And the future of this country obviously lies in the services sector. So, yes, we might get a deal. Yes, we may all breathe a sigh of relief. What is key to me is what a bigger share of the British economy is going to get in its long-term relationship with Europe. And on this, at the moment, we know absolutely nothing. This is because I thought I'd been far too cheerful so far, so I needed to end on a very dismal note. Thank you very much.
Gilles mentioned anger. Jan-Peter, I feel like sort of where we are, the tone of geopolitics at the moment is quite confrontational rather than sort of diplomatic, particularly across the Atlantic, I think, maybe. So what's your view on that? Is that what you're seeing? How do you feel about that?
You're right. It's a lot about emotions. It's about tough wording. It's about their own interests. A country like the US, they always felt that they had an international obligation to do the right things globally. Of course, you have your own interests, but now it's America first, and the tone of voice is really important. And that is necessary to analyze how you behave. So it's about, I don't like those deals, I want to have other deals. So the mindset is, it's my interest to do everything for the US, and that is also relevant for the wording. And the same counts for Australia and New Zealand and for Korea and with Europe. So now we will see what will happen with China. You will also see different tendencies. I think it's the interest of the American president to get out of that situation. And maybe there will be a kind of compromise. The question is, of course, if such a compromise would be there between China and the US, what will happen with Europe? Because we have a kind of timeout, but we don't know at the moment.
Yeah, but how do we shift that tone? Is it who's in power? Is that our issue?
I think talking, let's say, from the European perspective, I think it's good to talk about what do we have in common. You always know that if there are common challenges, you must have a common attitude, common approaches. You must have cooperation. That could be the tone of voice of Europe. I think that's an interesting thing. So a second point I would like to make, that is, when, for another example, Lisette referred to climate change. When President Trump said, I will step out of Paris, within a few days' time, there was an agreement between China and the European Union. What will happen? So I think it's, at this moment, so key to stay united as European countries because of Trump, because of Russia, and we must be very practical to reach the right results.
Yeah. I mean, you see, you talked about inequality, and a couple of the questions that are coming through here is really about that, leading that then to populism and the rise of those political movements. What do you see as the dangers of those, really, in enabling us to tackle issues on a more of an international scale?
Of course, I don't like populism, but you first have to analyze why do we have populism? What are the backgrounds? You can blame the populists, but you have to analyze why is it there. Here in UK, people, of course, were anxious about the future. Uncertainty is there. But you've seen in the United States that, in fact, there was a gap between Washington and ordinary people. People felt not represented in Washington. That was the reason why maybe a lot of people did not like personally Trump. Said, well, but he understands me. So, and you can see the same forces in countries like France and Austria and the Netherlands, Germany, and so on. So it's a phenomenon. You can see it in many Western countries in any case. Yeah. So it starts with why is populism there? And then you have to start a debate about their solutions, because what you can see, populists are exploiting sentiments, but if you are analyzing their views, their solutions, their convictions, their proposals, then it's a very bad story. Yeah. And also, if, let's say, if populists are confronted with the consequences of their ideas, then you see the difficulties.
Yeah. And Gilles, you talked about that in an economic term. Do you see it having an impact now? Is it something that's going to grow to affect the economies that are seeing more rises of populism?
No, yeah, definitely. I mean, I think populism, one aspect of the rise of populism, which I think is very often overlooked, is the fact that it might also be a manifestation of the fact that average age in our society has risen a lot. And what we call populism, to a large extent, is fear about personal outcomes and personal changes in life. Some of you may like Bruce Springsteen, right? He's just put out a great series of concerts in New York. I really tell you should listen to this. And he speaks about all the shocks of the late 1970s, early 1980s in the US, you know, the destruction of the manufacturing base in the US at the time. But there was no populist wave. And I checked it out. In 1980, the average age of a US worker was 27. 27. These guys could still change. They still could change states, completely change sectors, start a new life. They really had that possibility. Today, the average age is 47. Okay, so which is 1 year younger than me. So the possibility, personally, that you have to restart something if you lose your job, if the sector in which you work becomes obsolete, that possibility falls. So what you get is actually a rising number of people telling us, I probably know that I should accept change, but personally it's far too costly for me, and I'm taking far too much a risk. So what I want protection. I want protection from the state. I want protection against Chinese competition. I want protection against technological progress. And we have to recognize this, and we need to answer this in, I would say, an efficient way. And again, I will come to what's been going on in France recently. The elections of 2017 were remarkably ambiguous. You could say that the success of Macron was the combination of maybe what he's offering to everyone is a protection of social democracy. Is the guy who's going to make the French de facto social democracy efficient and sustainable? Or maybe he's the guy who's going to, in a way, explode the system and move to a more supply-side liberal system. There was this ambiguity. And to some extent, the Yellow Vest movement is a reaction by people saying, look, this protection of the social democracy is not what we're seeing. What we're seeing is a lot of supply-side reforms. And there's an imbalance. And this balance, finding the way to be inclusive in the reforms, is, I think, really central. People no longer have the second, third chances that they had 25 years ago.
Okay. And just switching topic, you mentioned China, the trade disagreements between the US and China. What broader impact are they having here in the EU, in Europe?
I think there's a big difference between the EU and the US when it comes to China, which is that we have demonstrated collectively in Europe that we can deal with China, we can trade with China to some sort of mutual benefit. We have a deficit with China, but we sell stuff to China. So it's never going to be as confrontational as it is in the US, because the problem the US has right now is that they don't sell anything to China apart from primary goods. We've always been able to maintain that capacity. Now, there is a confrontation on Chinese investment in the EU, and you can see how this is really triggering a confrontation, but at least on trade, I think it's far easier for us to come to some sort of understanding with China than it is for the US.
And Jan-Peter, what's your view from the EU? Obviously, China's got a very aggressive investment policy under its One Belt, One Road, and we see less maybe EU money going that way than is coming towards this way. How does the EU resolve that in terms of, the investment process?
Let me tell you a story. In 2012, my time after my time as Prime Minister, I was invited by the Chinese Prime Minister to attend a conference in Urumqi in the northwestern part. I had a meeting with him, and we also spoke about the euro. And he said, we want to support Europe, we want to support the euro. And of course they have their investment schemes, but there's also a kind of awareness that you should not let go down the euro because it has huge consequences. I like that approach because there was a kind of responsibility for what's happening in Europe. Greece had a lot of difficulties, but also China said, we will invest. I also see the other parts because they are in Africa and also for their own interest, let's be honest about it.
Yeah.
But in any case, if you have a good attitude, you can have the right meetings with the Chinese, but you have to invest in good context and you must have an honest debate because sometimes it's one-way traffic, that's true. On the other hand, there are opportunities a bit strange. If you have the One Belt, One Road approach, you have trains coming from China to Europe. It's one-way traffic.
Indeed, yeah.
We have to discuss that, that's clear.
Yeah. Thank you for your questions. Some of them are about 100 words long each time, so I'm struggling to read through them. They're basically about European integration and kind of what happens next, really. I'm just going to ask the simple question and I'm going to read the difficult ones. So in terms of around Brexit, there's basically, what would you advise Theresa May at this time? And also, what would you say to Michael Gove when he comes later? Sorry, that's the easier question. I'm going to dig through the other ones while you maybe answer that one.
So we start with the easy question.
Yeah.
What do I advise, what advice should be given to Theresa May? Well, I must say, sometimes I'm really concerned, and I think it's from a human point of view, it's really terrible what's happening. It's humiliating what she has to see in the UK Parliament. But when you're in politics, also there are sometimes limits. You've said that's it, and otherwise you can forget it. When you are active in politics, you always must know what are the limits of compromises. What do I want to reach? And I think she has a story to tell now with the deal. I think it will not be possible to get a better deal. I think this deal is in any case in the interest of the UK and Europe for the time being. You have to find a way out. If not, then it's total chaos. So I think also the members of parliament, and it's a lot about, let's say, egos, and it's also about political leadership. And we've seen David Cameron to win the election, Boris Johnson intended to become prime minister. So it's all there. But now it's serious stuff. You have to stop those political games. It's a matter now of feeling responsible about the future of the UK. So I think the deal she has, I think it's the best deal you can get now. And do not have the illusion that you can renegotiate it again. That has no use. Yeah. So my advice to her would be, this is the deal. You will not get a better one, and it's this or nothing.
Okay. Gilles talked about us becoming caricatures of ourselves, and the Brits like to apologise. I think we should just say a really big sorry, and move on. But, I mean, the other questions were really about, do we need, is the kind of reintegration of Europe then, should that be around a France, Germany, leading that, and then the others, what is the balance between that kind of European Union and versus our relationship with the US? So
in the time when I was Prime Minister, of course, you always had the meetings of the French President and the Chancellor of Germany. They always are coming together before such a meeting. At this moment, things have a bit changed, because you can see that Central and Eastern European countries are playing another role. We have the Spanish government, the Italian government, so it's not, let's say, traditional Paris-Berlin connection. Of course, it's still there. And that's the reason why I think it's necessary to talk together, not only about, let's say, France and Germany, but what is our common perspective on Europe. That's the reason why I spoke about developing new strategies regarding Europe. Yeah. Because it's not so easy to find the right compromises. So that keeps me busy. As I said, we know we must have a new view on Europe. I think Europe is able, as in the 50s and as in the 80s, to work on having a new wave of European integration. I think it's really necessary because it's confusing now. And I think that should be the binding factor in Europe. I know it's idealistic and you cannot really realize it so quickly because it is complicated, that's true. But the alternatives are worse. So I really hope that also from French side and German side that there will be kind of awareness, what can we do now in the interest of people here?
Yes,
that would be
all
my
look at ourselves in that way, yeah. And someone says Brexit and European integration is fairly small fry compared to the end of quantitative easing. Gilles, can you pick that one up, do you think? Is that really the greatest concern at the moment?
In the short run, it might well be. I mean, we are in the early days of living without QE in Europe. It's been remarkably composed so far, but we can see some cracks in the credit market in particular. It's something we need to be aware of. And it seems that a lot of investors have trouble adjusting to the idea that the nanny ECB is not going to be there every time. I remember 6 months ago, lots of conversations were still about, the ECB may stop buying sovereign bonds because it's politically too complicated, but they will surely find a way to continue buying corporate bonds. Well, no, they stopped, and they stopped both. And the bar for them to restart is, I think, very, very high. So we need to reflect on the quantity of risks that has been taken by a number of corporates in Europe. And one of the risks that we like to talk about in my firm is about the risk of a wave of fallen angels. Companies which went to the bond market, which were actually not used to going to the bond market, issued a lot and are now getting pinched. Just look at what happened to Telecom Italia, for instance, at the end of last year with quite an increase in their funding cost. That is definitely significant. In any case, I would say that on European integration, I'm afraid that a window of opportunity has been lost in any case last year. It's true that it took a lot to go through the 5 hours of the Sorbonne speech by Macron. It was maybe a bit long, his ideas about a new integrated Europe, but there was something there was substance there, and there was no real response coming from Germany. So honestly, I think it's too late. It's a train that has left the station. Okay. And what we can get maybe now is another round of emergency measures, if need be, but doing it in a very nice, harmonious, pre-digested way, I think is off the table.
It's maybe to add, Gilles, if you only would look at politicians at this moment in Europe, you can be a bit worried. And there are all kind of national backgrounds and so on. That was the reason why Larry Fink, you all know him, the Silver BlackRock, he said, it's also our own responsibility as the business sector. Mm. So if you talk about long-term value creation, if you talk about doing good for society, if you want to make a reality of the Sustainable Development Goals, it's also the business sector. So if you talk about Europe, what is the role of the business sector in Europe? What is the role of universities, of NGOs? So it's not only the politicians, it's more than that. And we must have kind of awareness that if we would continue with Brexit and so on, that's not an alternative. That if it's only a matter of crisis management, that cannot be the truth in the longer run. So that keeps him busy. So it's not only about the politicians, also about the business sector. They have to play an important role now.
Okay, is there anyone who wants to raise their hand? Oh, Lisette, yeah? The likelihood of the third option as a direction, if no one heard that from Lisette.
Of course, I said it's not easy. And maybe it's a bit idealistic. But let's say I've come to this point, not just because I'm a Christian Democrat or I'm pro-European, I'm just analyzing what are the alternatives at this moment. We must have an honest debate about it. And we have a lot of influential people, have young people, talk with them, talk about what is necessary to do. And I must say that I'm a bit worried if, let's say, China is going on with their economic strategies, with the One Belt, One Road approach, and we have an American president. I think we have a great history of Europe. We have a lot of great companies. We have universities. I think the values in Europe are okay. So it's a matter to reflect. And that's the reason why I said, that's the reason why I said, if you only look into the political arena, maybe you can be worried. And then you can imagine your question. But the question is, can we have such an attitude that is in interest of the European people, the societies, the businesses, the universities, and so on? And that gives me a bit of hope. But we have to do it together. And listen to inspiring people. This morning I attended the meeting with Balkenende. It's a beautiful example of a businessman who's taken up his responsibility. Also, I think that courage, that spirit we need in Europe.
Okay. And finally, just a quick question. Well, it's a difficult question about the real estate markets. We,
That's for Gilles, I suppose.
Well, we'll go both on this one, I think. Yeah, I mean, we acknowledge as an industry we're late cycle, we're quite cautious in the market, but there's still a lot of capital around. And really the feeling is that people know this can't go on, but they feel there's an unknown risk out there. So just very quickly, do you know what it is and when should we expect it?
I have trouble thinking of the risks that we kind of know about right now.
Yeah.
So I don't want to get dragged into conversation on the risks we might not have seen. It was interesting the responses to the poll because yes, political uncertainty obviously has a strong bearing on the market and especially in the real estate market. But I still believe we need to think about two things. One is the level of interest rates. I don't think I'm going to be very surprising in telling you that I don't think it's going to rise a lot in core Europe in the next 2 to 3 years. But we need to think about what could happen in the periphery. We've had some warning signals in 2018, and I'm not sure we can count on the same kind of funding costs we had the last 2 to 3 years in big parts of Southern Europe. Second, we have to think about the state of the banking sector, which is also an issue. We've been trying hard collectively in Europe to sort out the banking sector. Banking union was one of the ways to get there, but it's fair to say that some issues remain, especially again in the periphery. The ECB will do what it can. There will be probably another round of long-term liquidity injection in the system, but we're still talking about real big headwinds there. So can you get a very nice real estate cycle if the banking sector in large swathes of Europe is suffering? Probably not.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Jan-Peter, is that risk geopolitical, do you think?
Well, of course, everyone's following what's happening within the real estate sector. The good thing is that people in the real estate sector are always long-term thinkers. Whereas political debates, many times short-term focused. And I think at this moment it's so important to talk about long-term strategies. And you can see, I mentioned China. I mentioned the SDGs, that's a framework till 2030. So you can see that people are more and more aware of the fact that you must have long-term thinking, otherwise you will fail. And therefore it's important, your remarks, from what is happening. So I agree with the remarks of Gilles.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. It's been a fascinating session. Please join me in thanking Jan-Peter and Gilles. Thank you.